Welcome to today's Explainer. So today we're going to unpack a seriously hilarious literary survival guide from Class X English. We're looking at a poem called How to Tell Wild Animals. And look, I promise you, this is definitely not your standard dry biology lesson. Not at all. Instead, we're diving into a piece of literature that totally flips the script on how we interact with the natural world. It basically trades in your standard binoculars and safety guides for pure sarcasm and wit. But hey, before we get all academic and dig into the text, I actually want you to ask yourself a super practical question. How would you react if you encountered a deadly beast out in the wild? I mean, most of us would probably panic, run for our lives, or just absolutely freeze, right? But what if the way you figured out what kind of animal was literally about to eat you was by paying super close attention to its distinctive features while it was attacking you? It's an absolutely ridiculous premise, and you know what? That is exactly the joke we're about to explore today. Okay, so let's kick things off with this brilliant quote. It just perfectly captures the poem's absurd, totally whimsical premise. It goes, "If you see any creature that is funny, it might be a wild animal, but never worry." I love that. It perfectly sets the stage for us. We are absolutely not meant to worry here. We're meant to laugh. This poem takes the very real, honestly pretty grim danger of wild animals and turns the whole thing into an absolute comedy show. Here's how we're going to break it all down today. First, we'll meet the master of parody. Then we'll look at identifying dangerous beasts. After that, we'll break down the mechanics of humor and wrap it all up with our key takeaway. All right, let's jump right into part one, the master of parody. You know, to truly understand a piece of satirical writing, you really have to understand the mind of the person who actually wrote it. So let's talk about Carolyn Wells. She was born in 1862, and she was a highly prolific American poet and humorist. Now, if you were to just look at a vintage portrait of her, you might honestly expect some really stiff, formal Victorian-era poetry. But actually, she was the exact opposite. She was known for being incredibly witty, writing this hilarious poetry alongside some pretty great mystery novels. In fact, her resume is just astounding. Get this, she wrote over 100 books in her lifetime. 100! She specialized in something called light verse and parody and was famous for her clever wordplay and satire. The poem we're looking at today was actually published back in the early 20th century as part of a comic anthology, so she definitely wasn't trying to write a textbook here. Instead, she was actively writing a parody of those very serious safari guides and animal manuals that were super popular back then. And honestly, her work brilliantly illustrates this whole genre of light verse. Basically, the primary goal here is amusement rather than serious education. Light verse is all about being, well, lighthearted. It's playful, it's cheerful, and it definitely doesn't take itself too seriously. Carolyn Wells used this genre perfectly to provide playful commentary on a subject, which in this case is nature observation. So instead of this deep reverence for the deadly majesty of these creatures, she basically treats them like punchlines in a joke. Moving right along to section 2, identifying dangerous beasts. So how exactly does Wells suggest we identify these creatures out in the wild? Well, first up on our totally unhelpful safari, we have the heavy hitters. She hilariously points out that an Asian lion is this large, tawny beast, and the absolute best way to know it's a lion is if it roars at you so fiercely that you are literally dying of fright. I mean, it's a bit late by then, right? Then she contrasts this with the Bengal tiger, noting its sleek black stripes on a yellow background. And her incredibly helpful tip for identifying a tiger, you know it's a tiger if it simply eats you. It's just this deadpan delivery of terrible, fatal advice that makes her observations so unbelievably funny. And the joke just keeps building with the other animals. She offers these glaringly obvious descriptions of bears and crocodiles, but presents them as if they're these profound scientific discoveries. For the bear, she essentially says, hey, if you're walking in a yard and you meet a creature that hugs you very, very hard, yep, it's a bear. And obviously, we're not talking about a friendly hug here. Then for the crocodile, she playfully separates it from a hyena by pointing out that a crocodile is the one weeping tears while it eats its prey. You know, a classic reference to crocodile tears. The contrast she creates between these creatures is just fantastic. Like on one hand, you have the hyena, which Wells identifies by its merry, deceptive smiles, right before it attacks you, of course. On the other hand, she features the chameleon. And her expert advice for this one? Well, a chameleon is small, has no ears, and no wings. So if there is absolutely nothing on the tree, then what you're seeing is the chameleon. It's such a brilliant joke about camouflage, and it perfectly highlights her playful commentary on nature observation. Which brings us to our third section, the mechanics of humor.
Now that we've survived these animal encounters, well, at least in theory anyway, let's look at the actual poetic mechanics that make this poem so funny. Wells uses a very specific structure to keep the move light. She relies on this bouncy AABB rhyme scheme of couplets. Just listen to the rhythm here. If roaring sound strikes all with fright, a lion near you, that's the sight. Fright, sight. It establishes this sing-song, almost nursery rhyme kind of comic rhythm. It keeps you smiling, even though she is literally talking about a lion roaring at a terrified victim.
So the really crucial point here is how she layers multiple poetic devices to actually pull this off, because it's not just the rhyme scheme. She uses irony heavily, presenting incredibly dangerous animals in this lighthearted, casual manner. She uses exaggeration, where she takes completely obvious physical traits and presents them as if they're deep, scholarly insights. She uses simile and metaphor to compare physical features, and she also sprinkles in alliteration, repeating consonant sounds, just to really enhance that comic, bouncy effect.
Really, the entire poem relies on this massive contrast. It is the ultimate mock-serious tone. She takes the grim reality of being mauled or eaten by wild animals and completely frames it with an incredibly cheerful, almost mischievous mood. By pretending to educate the reader while actually giving them advice that would straight up get them killed in the wild, she creates just a perfectly executed parody.
All right, let's wrap things up with Section 4, Key Takeaways. Let's synthesize all these ideas into the core takeaways you'll actually need for your exams, essays, or literature discussions. So if you're taking notes, these are definitely the concepts to lock in. First, remember that the poem is a classic example of light verse. It uses humor purely to entertain, not to actually teach anything. Second, the animal descriptions are wildly exaggerated for comic effect. Third, that AABB rhyme scheme is really the engine that creates that playful sing-song quality. The tone is heavily ironic and mock-serious. And ultimately, rather than treating nature with this terrifying reverence, Carolyn Wells just celebrates it through sheer, unadulterated laughter. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If nature really is this wildly dangerous, isn't a sense of humor kind of the best survival tool we have? Carolyn Wells certainly thought so. I highly encourage you to go check out more of her brilliant parodies and see how she turns the totally mundane into the absolutely hilarious. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, stay curious.